All right, this is the Dales Report, and I'm happy to be joined today with Dr. Ingmar Gorman. He joins us. He is the co-founder of Fluence Training and who is a psychologist who provides training to mental health professionals in the psychedelic industry. Dr. Gorman, I appreciate you joining me here on the podcast.
Wonderful to be here. Thank
You're
you for the invitation.
In New York City?
That's correct.
Did you survive the hurricane earlier this week?
We did, luckily, yes. Yeah, everything is more or less back to normal where I'm at in Manhattan. But some places are still recovering, I hear.
Yeah, good to see. Wanted to have you on and appreciate you joining us. Want to begin with how you started in this field so my viewers can get an understanding of who you are and the credentials you have. You're co-founder of Fluence Training with yourself and Dr. Elizabeth Nielsen. You have extensive psychiatric training and a number of research institutions located across America. So what attracted you to psychedelic medicine specifically over, say, conventional psychiatric-based medicine?
Sure. Well, we're both psychologists, clinical psychologists by training. And so our expertise really is in the delivery of psychotherapy,
okay,
but also conducting research and also evaluating kind of like the scientific integrity of that research. So no, I don't think I would be interested in the traditional pharmacological treatments if there wasn't some sort of component of psychotherapy or like a psychosocial intervention. And this is such a huge paradigm shift to move away from the traditional view of like psychotherapy versus pharmaceutical intervention. Instead, look at the synergy between drug-assisted psychotherapy and really kind of digging into that combination and understanding, well, why is it that this could be really helpful? It's just something that's endlessly fascinating to me. And if I may add one more piece to this.
Yeah, of course.
Is that the training in the psychedelic psychotherapy piece of this you can't really underestimate it. You have to think about how powerful these compounds are psychologically.
Yeah.
The sensitivity of the people that we're working with, because they're coming in with various symptoms or diagnoses. And then the vulnerable states that these drugs kind of can put a person in. And so a therapist, a practitioner, somebody working with these compounds, they have to understand this from both a biological and a psychological perspective. And it's a huge undertaking.
Right.
So far, we've been able to really meet at Fluence.
So why do you believe that we are potentially in a huge paradigm shift with where we are, where the industry has been, and where we are up to this point and where we go, I guess, moving forward, given the amount of awareness this industry has really precipitated over the past 12 months?
Yeah, it's really incredible. So, I started with my interest in this field started about 15 years ago.
Yeah.
And so, if you asked me back then, would I think that we would be where we are today? I don't think I could have predicted it.
Really?
But yeah, really. I do think that there was a spark in.
What was it like 15 years ago? Like, what
well,
would that?
Let's say it was a lot easier to keep up with the number of publications that were coming out. Like, the number of completed clinical trials, it was like maybe one a year. And I mean, or the number of initiated studies were a few a year back in 2010, 2011, or 2005, 2006. I was at a conference in Basel, Switzerland. The world's psychedelic forum, and then there was the LSD forum, and it was really wonderful. But it was a huge conference, relatively, of 3,000 people, and it was really engaging. But there really weren't that many studies going on concurrently. And today, I obviously got in this field 15 years ago, thinking that it had some real huge potential. But in the last 12 months, like you alluded to, it's been absolutely mind-blowing.
Hasn't it?
The pace that we've moved, yes, in the last year in terms of the number of emerging companies, the number of planned and ongoing clinical trials, number of new indications that are being looked at. And I want to say that, we're here because in some ways we are standing on the shoulders of giants, and we really should recognize the MAPS, the USONA, the Hefter, even groups like Arrowhead that have been kind of keeping the torch lit for 35, 40 years, so that today we can be at this place to be expanding in this industry so rapidly.
I applaud you for starting within the industry 15 years ago. I'm sure those weren't easy days, but you obviously believed in it. What do you think was the turning point when it came to growing the amount of everywhere you look now, it seems like there's trials taking place by so many companies. Some, obviously you have to be careful of. There's diversification that a lot of these companies will have to develop. But most importantly, as you just said, we might have had one trial annually back 15 years ago to where we are today. So what was that turning point, you think?
That's a good question. I think any answer that it's sort of like it's overdetermined.
Yeah.
So I could pick up one, and that is not the only answer. I'm going to pick one actually that was personally significant for me, and a lot of people actually mentioned this, which is Michael Pollan's book, but
Okay.
actually not his book, but his New Yorker paper or his article that came out a few years prior to his book. And the way that I experienced that was as a trainee in my clinical psychology department. I used to go on yearly what we called externships. So we're being interviewed and evaluated by established people in hospitals in New York City. And they would ask me about my interests, and I would say psychedelics. And prior to that New Yorker paper coming out, people would sort of react with me saying, "Oh, that's kind of weird," or they may not, know about it, about psychedelic research. And then after that article came out, I was able to talk about it with established people in the field, and they had a reference point. They would say, "Oh, like that article that came out by Michael Pollan," and that was yes. And to me, I do think that this is psychedelics have been and still to some degree are quite stigmatized.
Okay.
And I do think that the sort of a little bit of bringing in the normalcy of this, so that this is something that we can have a conversation around.
Yes.
And for it to not be a career suicide, as for some it was.
Yeah.
I think that has really led to where we are today, where businesses can come out and say, yes, we're gonna look into this compound, or we're gonna create this software or whatever to support the industry.
So I have to ask, you brought up the word stigmatize. Knowing that you're a doctor, you speak to obviously a lot of people in the field day to day. Are doctors more, I guess, that are specialized in conventional medicine, are they starting to take more interest about the research that is being manufactured in this industry? Like, what trends are you seeing day to day related to this industry that will improve the overall health of it moving forward?
Yeah, I do. I think that so we see that in terms of our trainings that we currently offer to the public, that the diverse number of professionals coming to us, it's broadened.
Mm-hmm.
I think that, maybe to speak a little bit about the Tryp training we did, what was really actually refreshing for me was we asked of the professionals who were there, how many of them were familiar with MAPS.
Okay.
And I use MAPS as a reference point because it's one of the most well-known organizations in this field.
Of course.
And the majority of the attendees, the trainees, actually never heard of MAPS.
Wow, really?
And yeah. And but they heard about, there was a buzz about psychedelic therapy, right, and the potential of it. So that was on their radar, but the exact players, they're not aware of that. And I'll just say that they were incredible trainees. I mean, they picked up what we were teaching really rapidly, with a lot of enthusiasm. And actually, there were a few people there who were talking about this new emerging field as something that was revitalizing to them for their career. These are the more established people who've been in the field for quite a while, and they're looking for something new and exciting, with more potential to help people than the standard treatments that we currently have. And this is what it was for them.
Yeah, it goes to show, as much as this is our lives, people like you and I that are following this industry closely, even more so for you being a doctor, we're still very much in the early days of this industry, because there's people outside of this that still in a lot of ways are unaware, but huge growth in the last 12 months.
Absolutely.
One of the companies that we follow closely is Tryp Therapeutics. They've selected you to conduct psychotherapist training for its upcoming phase 2A clinical trial using synthetic psilocybin in combination with psychotherapy for overeating disorders. What I've learned is that your organization provides services specifically for phased and post-trial clinical studies in the psychedelic industry. So first, how does this all come to fruition? Like, can you explain how this works when someone like yourself is selected to conduct a phase 2 trial?
Well, so there's a lot to say there, right? So
yeah, of course,
and it can take a lot of different shapes. So I'm I have been a site co-principal investigator for MAPS. So in which case my role is to manage and run the site for the MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for PTSD.
Yep.
My role with Tryp is a little bit different. There, we were brought in as experts who have an expertise in the psychotherapy side of delivering, or the psychotherapy side of a drug trial that is going through the FDA process of research review and potentially approval. So how are we selected? Well, I think it comes from pretty much what I had alluded to, which is that there are not really many people in the world or companies for that matter in the world,
Right.
who bring together this expertise of psychotherapy, of these novel compounds, as well as the experience, because it's very different to, as everyone knows, it's one thing to sort of know something intellectually. It's another thing to actually go through all the steps involved in a drug development process and know where where are the challenges, where are the barriers, what are some of the tips. And one thing I will say there to that is that the FDA is the Food and Drug Administration.
Yes.
Psychotherapy is not in there. They don't regulate psychotherapy.
Right.
And yet, whether it be digital therapeutics or psychotherapy or what have you, there is some sort of again, it's not the drug alone. It's the drug combined with something that synergizes with the drug, that engages the participant psychologically. And so because the FDA doesn't regulate psychotherapy, it is beginning to look at how these studies for these drug developers are designed and making sure that there is a psychotherapy manual.
Right.
That there is some attention to that component for safety and for ethics.
Right.
And the average drug company doesn't know anything about psychotherapy because that's not what they do. And so that's where Fluence can come in and address this kind of lack of knowledge, and again, bring in our wisdom and from actually doing this work.
So how monumental is it, I guess, in the early days for companies to be conducting phase 2 trials? Because when I look at this industry from potential patient standpoint and investors as well, when they see companies that are into a phase 2, it generates a lot of interest. So how monumental is it?
Can you tell me what you mean by monumental?
Well, I think it garners a lot of interest to see the progress that companies are making once they're into a phase 2, that their pipeline, as far as the research that they're conducting, is a lot more advanced than most other companies within the space.
Right.
Makes
Now
sense?
I understand what you mean. Yes. Well, sure. So, just to say that preclinical research, phase 1 research, you're usually just looking at safety of a substance in a healthy individual. When you're looking at phase 2 and beyond, or really beginning at phase 2, you're beginning to test the hypothesis, right? Like, could this new compound in psychotherapy be helpful for a particular diagnosis and or set of symptoms? And yeah, it's a very, very big step, because it's the beginning of gathering the evidence to then move into a larger study, and then potentially post-approval looking at phase 4, looking at how these treatments, how truly effective they are in the real world. So that those phase 2 studies really are the seed and the beginning of examining the potential that these treatments have.
You, being the principal co-founder of Fluence Training, both you and Dr. Elizabeth Nielsen have direct lead investigator experience in a phase 3 trial using MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for PTSD, as you mentioned earlier, among a list of psychiatric and academic institutions. So tell us about that experience and how that has kind of shaped your organization.
Yeah, absolutely. I really appreciate this question. So what I'm really proud of at Fluence is that we bring therapists from the community, and we're aware of their needs, as well as working with therapists who are working in clinical trials. And so you might think it's the same job. You take the therapist, you put them in the room, have them do the psychedelic therapy, facilitate the session, and then they leave, and that's it. But actually, a therapist in the community and the therapist in a clinical trial are very, very different.
How
just
so?
For example, treatment manualization.
Okay.
Or managing or observing and recording adverse events. There are a lot of aspects of a clinical trial that you basically need to, well, it's a scientific study, right? So you need to maintain certain and control certain variables, where there's a lot more flexibility in community treatment in the real world. But if you allow for that flexibility, you're potentially undermining the research project. And so, you asked me about my experience working with MAPS, where I'm still a therapist, and Elizabeth is a co-principal investigator. Well, that experience in those studies were really crucial for us to be able to, again, like, understand what the differences are, and bring that to our trainings at Fluence for other drug development companies. And one thing I want to add, though, that can be, because I'm also thinking not just where we are now, but also where are we going to be in 3, 4, 5, 10 years down the line. And our relationship and our attention to the community therapists is also very, very important, because ultimately what the goals of these companies are, and whether profit or nonprofit, is that these treatments are going to be used.
Of course.
They're going to be disseminated. And you need to have, or we have, a relationship with the community clinicians. And then you go through another adjustment period, where how do you take the scientific research, the psychotherapy that was implemented there, and how do you make it accessible, and not just accessible, but deliverable by the therapists to their patients in the real world. And that's really where the rubber hits the road.
It's fascinating, to say the least. It's a lot to learn, but we need hope, right? The system's broke, and a lot of people I speak to, they all feel the same way. I have to ask too, the requirement when first tailoring specific training programs to fit specific needs of any given clinical trial indication. What's that process like? And for example, like the psychotherapy component of the upcoming phase 2 with Tryp for eating disorders is obviously different than, say, a psychotherapy component for PTSD trial with DMT. So how do you plan accordingly?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. You highlighted that difference. And it's actually a pretty complicated process. So I'll tell you some of the things that go into it. One thing is closely looking at what the investigational product is, or in the case, the psychedelic or the drug, and understanding its pharmacology, and it's also its psychological effects, as well as understanding the indication, right? Some people have this assumption that, well, psilocybin is going to be, and the therapy is going to be the same for each indication, and that's not the case.
Which is furthest from the truth, right?
That's right. That's right. And that's also connected to your, from a scientific perspective, to your outcomes. Like, it's really important that the study is set up in a way where you're making sure that you're measuring what your hypothesis is, how your hypothesis is set up, and making sure that the psychotherapy hopefully supports the benefit that you are actually examining. And also, we need to be really pragmatic, because people can be sometimes quite ideological about how they believe psychedelics work. And the fact of the matter is that we don't. I mean, of course, there's some biological evidence, and there's some really good statistics around certain concepts like the mystical experience, but we don't really fully understand how it works. And so we have to be really pragmatic when we are designing the therapy manuals or contributing to training, that we don't make people too close-minded about, or the therapists in particular, and when they're talking to participants, that they have a degree of openness around what might be helping actually in the psychedelic experience or the psychedelic treatment. And I actually want to give you, if it's okay, an example of this with
I would love to hear it.
So this was a learning experience for me. So Dr. Jennifer Miller, she's at the University of Florida.
Yeah.
And we were talking about, or I was actually learning quite a lot about hypothalamic obesity. And one of the things that she had mentioned as we were talking was, so she was talking about how people with these symptoms of extreme overeating are very sensitive to the topic of food. So I'll pause there for a second, and I'll tell you how the average psychedelic clinical trial works, let's say with MDMA for PTSD, is that a person can eat a snack, a participant can have a snack whenever they like, whenever they feel hungry. MDMA it does suppress appetite a little bit, but usually people would want a fruit or something at some point over the 8 hours that we're together. If we were to introduce that kind of structure, or train the therapist to talk about the snack in that way with the people who are suffering with hypothalamic obesity, it would be incredibly anxiety provoking for them because they will be fixated on when the food will arrive. And what
Right.
such with people living with this ailment, they have very scheduled times when the food arrives and when they eat. And
Okay.
so you can imagine how if we weren't very careful about how we talk about this, how a person, say, on psilocybin, um, not knowing exactly when the food will arrive, there would be potentially a lot of anxiety that would come up, and that could
Mm-hmm.
potentially interfere with the effectiveness of the psilocybin treatment. And so here's just, I tell you all of this. This is one little tiny example, this one little thing around
Right.
wording and food. You would think is not really relevant to the therapy or the psilocybin, but actually could be a crucial piece, and that we can't overlook that.
Well, I think that we're starting to see the true realm of it all because it's, at first it was depression, anxiety, there's eating disorders, companies getting involved in gambling addiction, sex. There is a number of things at play here, but I have to ask, is there one specific compound that you think FDA, Health Canada, that you think will become legalized first versus another? Is it psilocybin? Is that a question you want to answer?
I'll tell you. I'll tell you no, and I'll tell you why. Because um, as somebody who's involved in these studies, it's not. It doesn't have to do with the business side of it. It actually has to do with the FDA side.
Okay.
So I have to be very careful about the language that I use around. So I say the word potential a lot, and that's because
Okay.
I can't be saying that these treatments that are still under investigation um, can, um, have the utility that they are not yet determined to have.
Makes
The
sense.
statistics, the outcomes are very strong so far. Question is, can we continue to find these results? Um, I would put it this way, right? I mean, it's not a mystery that that MDMA, in terms of and MAPS' research, they are furthest along in
Yes.
the FDA
Yeah,
process.
it's what feared a lot too. How about I frame it this way? I know I asked earlier about how much growth you think the industry will grow. So 15 years ago, you got into this industry. If we were to look ahead at 10 years down the line, do you think psychedelic compounds in combination with psychedelic assisted therapy can supplant conventional psychiatric treatment for not only for depressive disorders, but eating and pain disorders like Tryp Therapeutics is researching?
I would say that the potential is definitely there.
Okay.
I think that Um, I think we're already seeing a transition, right? For example,
Yes.
so we can look at TRD, treatment-resistant depression, or treatment-resistant or chronic PTSD, or end-of-life anxiety or anxiety related to a terminal illness. Those are all diagnoses that are at the extreme end of the spectrum, and
Hmm.
those were the emerging studies. Now, my gosh, 10, 10 years ago. And now you're looking at studies that are looking at not treatment resistant depression, but just major depressive disorder, right?
Hmm.
So we're seeing a movement towards evaluation of ailments that more people suffer from, and also that are a little bit more in the mainstream. Now, could it supplant existing treatments? My attitude, ultimately, the reason why I'm in this is because I want people to get better, and I want to help
Hmm.
people. So whatever helps them. I think that for some people who are treated with traditional antidepressants and are benefiting from that, that's wonderful. But
Yeah.
there are also a lot of people who aren't benefiting from them, for whom these treatments could be another option, and they could potentially become a first-line treatment rather than having somebody be on an SSRI for a year, 5, 10, 20 years.
Hmm.
Perhaps we try uh, something like psilocybin for depression first, see how that works. If that doesn't work, then maybe we try an SSRI. But if it does work, we've now helped a person essentially not be as dependent on a pharmaceutical like
If
SSRI.
you could,
Mhm.
if you could pinpoint, I'll leave it with this. If
Yeah.
you could pinpoint one word about your experience in this industry and moving forward on the future of this industry, what do you think it would be?
The first one that came to my mind was transformation.
Okay,
And
it's
that's
great.
because it's personally transformed me so far, and I think that it has the potential to transform the lives of many other people into the future.
It's excellent. Listen, I really appreciate you joining us here today. It's been very informative. I could probably sit here all afternoon and talk to you, but I got a million other questions, but we'll have to have you back on again. But this has been great. And it's like exciting to see, you know, people like yourselves that are on the ground day to day, learning a lot about this and educating people on the industry as a whole and, you know, what the future holds for it. So it's been great, but I appreciate you taking the time to connect with us here today.
Absolutely. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Keep in touch.
Yeah, thank you. I will.